Hey all you marvelous Medusa and Ephyrae. My name is Mike and I'm one of the animal care specialists here at Living Coast taking care of the aquatic animals. Today we're going to be talking about the species of jellyfish that we care for here at the Brookfield Zoo. So the first species we have are moon jellyfish. And these are a type of invertebrate. So some people say jellyfish, some people say sea jelly, some people just say jelly. It's important to note that they are not fish, so if you say jellyfish, you're probably fine, but just note that you're not actually talking about fish. They are a type of invertebrate, which means they don't have a backbone. They are in the phylum Cnidaria, which means they're related to corals and sea anemones and things like that. And they have stinging cells, as many of you probably know. The true jellies are in class Scyphozoa. So true jellies are the ones that we sort of recognize, like our moon jellies here. They have a bell, they pulse, and they swim around in ocean currents. So they're referred to as planktonic. So planktonic animals, like I said, swim around in ocean currents. They don't really get to choose where they go. The ocean currents kind of push them along. They have a little bit of say-so in where they're going, but mostly they're being pushed around by ocean currents. So one of the more interesting aspects to taking care of jellyfish is that they have a fairly complicated life cycle. So they have 4 stages. Unfortunately, we do have some examples of each life cycle stage that we can show you. So we can start off with the first stage, I guess. So these are jellyfish polyps. So you can see they are attached to a plastic plate. They are, you call them benthic or sessile. They don't move around a whole lot. They pretty much just stay attached to the plate or wherever they land in the wild. And they eat plankton just like an adult jellyfish, but they don't move around a lot. So sit there. They look a lot like a little tiny sea anemone, and like I said, they're cnidarians, so they're pretty closely related to anemones. And then they go through a process called strobilation. So they'll start off at a polyp, like this lovely paper model that one of my teammates made for us, and then they'll do what we call strobilation. So they'll create a little stack of pancakes, basically, of little ephyra. Now, obviously, there's no social distancing here, so eventually, as they become mature, the ephyra will pop off and then go off and live its free swimming stage of its life. So we also have some ephyra to show you. So let me grab those. So you can see the ephyra are teeny tiny, just a few millimeters across. They have 8 lappets, or kind of arm-like structures. And their job is basically to make their way out into the ocean currents. Here, let's see if we can get these guys up into the water column so you can see them a little better. So they'll kind of make their way around into the ocean currents and go into new places. Now, it's important to note that all of these will be clones of the polyp that made them. So they're genetically identical animals to the ones that to the polyp that strobilated to create them. And then eventually, after a few weeks to a month or so, they become the reproductive animal, the adult Medusa that you see and that you kind of recognize.
So do all jellyfish sting?
So yeah, jellyfish do have stinging cells called cnidocytes, and they're loaded with harpoons called nematocysts. Those nematocysts are triggered by pressure chemosensory, and if you touch them, they will shoot these little harpoons into their prey or any predators that potentially try to eat them. But not every jellyfish is a strong stinger. So moon jellies are pretty mild. Only if you have pretty sensitive skin will you be affected in a strong way by a moon jellyfish or an upside-down jellyfish, the other species that we take care of here.
So if you are stung by a jellyfish, that's poison, or that's just the
venom? You're being envenomated by those little tiny harpoons. so you definitely don't need to pee on yourself, as a lot of people think you might have to. Vinegar is a good way to neutralize those and keep more nematocysts from firing. And then if you can kind of scrape them off with something like a credit card, scrape off any tentacles so that you don't get more stinging cells.
Why are they so translucent?
Well, that's their camouflage. So jellyfish live in the open ocean, so there's nothing to camouflage against per se except the water. So by being clear or translucent, they can camouflage themselves in open water.
Do they have tentacles?
Yeah, so you can see as they pulse, on the outer edge of the bell they have tentacles which are very fine, and those are used for grabbing food. And then they also have oral arms, which are those kind of thicker, fleshier arms that attach to the mouth. And their mouth and their butt is pretty much the same hole. So they eat, they digest their food, and then kind of spit it out through the same spot. So they're kind of amazing in that way as well. So I do have, let's see, some of the food that we feed them here. So we feed them brine shrimp nauplii. So if you've ever raised sea monkeys, it's the same thing. We just hatch them out and feed them when they're very small, freshly hatched. So you can get these as cysts. They live in salt lakes, so somewhere like Salt Lake City, Utah, and some other salt lakes around the world. Yeah, you just hatch them out overnight, and they'll hatch into these little tiny critters here, and that's a perfect substitute for the plankton that they would be eating in the wild.
What are the 4 circles on them?
Sure, so those are gonads. So like I said, this is the reproductive stage of the jellyfish. So they're going to be releasing sperm and eggs into the water, which then turn into, they eventually turn back into a polyp. That's gonads, and then also some of their stomach tissue goes into it as well. So if you look at some of them, you'll see that they have some reddish in their around their horseshoe shaped, which is the gonad. That's actually the food that they've eaten. The brine shrimp nauplii are red. So when you see a jelly that has like those red structures, they've just eaten.
So are all moon jellies this color?
Yeah, most moon jellies are pretty clear. There are some species that have similar pigments to them. Moon jellies are kind of a group of jellies, as researchers are finding out. So I think originally people would just say moon jelly to mean a jelly from anywhere. You can find these on both coasts, moon jellies anyway. But they probably are going to end up being different species as they continue to work out the genetics of these things.
And how big do they get?
They get up to the size of about a dinner plate. So the bigger ones in there are a little over a year, and then the smaller ones are a next generation of animals, and they are about 4 months old.
And can you tell the males and the females apart?
Sure. So those horseshoe structures, for a female, it'll be a little bit more diffuse looking, whereas a male will be more like a solid line. So you can tell a little bit, especially as they get older. If you want, you can take a peek at the upside down jellies, the other species of jellies that we care for here. So you can see these guys are sitting on the substrate, so they're scyphozoan, just like the moon jelly, and they are capable of swimming. If you take a look, there's one kind of bouncing around and back. Oh, he just went out of view. So they can swim around if they want to find a new place, but for the most part, they sit on the bottom in mangrove areas and seagrass areas, and then they just face upward. So they do eat some plankton like the other jellies, but they also have special cells called zooxanthellae, which are algae cells, and they can then use extra sugars that these algae produce to help produce food for themselves as well. So it's a symbiotic relationship. So you can see that little guy, he's probably looking for a new spot, a sunnier spot from where he was sitting with all his buddies. But for the most part, these guys are going to be benthic or bottom dwelling.
What are their predators?
So sure, jellies are commonly fed upon by sea turtles, ocean sunfish, which are one of the largest, or the largest bony fish in the sea. And then even humans sometimes will eat jellyfish. So there are a lot of things that may eat jellyfish. There's also a lot of things that live with jellyfish. A lot of jacks and other small fish will take refuge in their tentacles and hide amongst them to stay safe from larger predators.
So how do the upside-down jellyfish eat?
Same way as the other jellies. So they have those tentacles that they use to grab prey, and then they'll pull that to their mouth, which is sort of in their center. They also have those kind of bluish vesicles that you can see on some of them. And those are places where they can store a lot of zooxanthellae, those special algae cells that they have in their tissues. And then they can use those to produce, the algae produces extra sugars from the sunlight, and then that helps feed the jellies as well.
So what do the upside-down jellyfish eat?
Same thing. So light and plankton, just like the moons, but the moons will not be able to utilize light as a food source.
Do they have... hold on, I lost my question. How do they glow?
So these guys are just under some bright light. So obviously because they have those special algae cells in their tissues, they need to have pretty bright lighting. So these guys are a little brighter because of the strong lights that we put on here to help them produce that food. But otherwise they don't glow, although there are some bioluminescent jellies out there in the world.
How long do they live?
It depends on the jelly. A lot of times they're fairly seasonal. Like I said, the moons are about a year old. These guys we got at the end of last year in September. So they can live 1 to 2 years, potentially even a little longer. Those polyps that we looked at, those can potentially live for many, many years. And then we can kind of induce those to strobilate if we need more jellyfish on exhibit.
Are these jellies stuck to the floor?
They're not stuck in any way. They're just kind of gently setting there, pulsing to stay in place. But if they wanted to move, they are perfectly capable of moving.
How many different types of jellies are there?
There are hundreds of species, and probably many that we don't know about. They can be found in kind of all environments. There's even a freshwater species of jellyfish. And then there are deep sea species, which obviously are more challenging to study and research.
How do they see, or can they see?
Sure. So jellyfish have a structure called a rhopalium, which is around the perimeter of the bell, and that helps them see light and light and darkness, and also helps them know which way is up and which way is down. So they can kind of move to some degree based on that, and they can pulse irregularly a little bit to move in one direction or another. But for the most part, things like the moon jellies are at the mercy of currents. So.
Are they preyed on by stingrays?
I'm not familiar with stingrays eating them. They're going to probably be more interested in eating things like crustaceans and mussels and things of that nature. So they're probably not on the top of the list for a stingray to eat.
We've got a couple of questions about how they reproduce. So do you want to show us the life cycle again?
Sure.
For the people who came in a little bit later.
So we'll start with the polyp. I think that's probably the most interesting stage. I think a lot of people don't realize that jellyfish, even though they're kind of pulsing and moving around, start off their lives in this sort of stage here. And they just kind of look like a little fuzzy, tiny anemone. And you can see they have tentacles just like an adult jellyfish, and they still have stinging cells that they use to catch plankton and things that float by. And then, let's see here. And then Ephyra are kind of the next stage. So these are, maybe you'd call them juvenile jellies. It's just another stage of the life cycle. So these come directly out of the polyps, and they are all clones if they're from the same polyp. So they genetically are the same, and it's a way that a polyp can spread to new oceans and seas without leaving its happy spot that it's found to live in.
Let's see. Are either of these jellyfish endangered?
They are not. Jellyfish are something that can be, jellyfish blooms can be a sign of environmental trouble sometimes. So they can also, so they like warmer oceans. So if the ocean warms up, you can get jellyfish blooms. Not all species, but the moon jellies and some others for sure. So not endangered, but potentially a sign of troubled seas, I suppose you could say.
Can you get jellyfish at a pet store?
They're probably not the best pet. They need kind of special water flow that keeps them suspended in the center of an exhibit. The standard kind of square and rectangle tanks that you can find at a pet shop won't really keep a jellyfish happy long term. Potentially you could keep upside down jellyfish as long as you don't make sure that there's nowhere that they could get stuck to an overflow, but then again you do need that bright lighting. So I would say definitely start with like a reef tank or some other saltwater species before you move on to jellyfish if you really wanted to try and keep them.
How long is each stage of their life cycle?
It really depends. The polyps can live for probably many years, decades even, until something either eats them or they sit along. The polyps can also bud, so they can kind of split in half essentially and form two new polyps, so they can spread in that way. So they're almost immortal, I would say. I don't know, I don't want to say immortal, but almost immortal. They can live genetically for a very, very long time, but maybe the individual might not be the same individual. The Ephyra depends on the species. For the moon jellies, it's just a matter of a few weeks before they start to look like an adult medusa, and then the medusa we can have for a few years on exhibit, and in the wild probably a little bit less than that, just based on how they do in the ocean. They're very much at the mercy of ocean currents, so sometimes that works in their favor and sometimes it doesn't, so they don't tend to live for a very, very long time in that stage.
Do they have brains?
They don't. They're very simple. They have their mesoglia kind of is the middle of their body, and that's just a little bit of collagen. They have nerves and things that they can sort of feel, but they don't really have a brain, so to speak.
And why are they called jellyfish?
It's because of their sort of texture. They're very gelatinous, which helps them sort of stay neutrally buoyant. So that mesoglia made of collagen, it's basically a little bit of protein. It's neutrally buoyant, which means they don't have to work very hard to float or sink. They can kind of just stay level in the water column. All right. All right, well, thank you guys very much for joining us here and talking a little bit about jellies. We're very excited to have you back once we're open again, so you can come out and see our jellyfish and all the rest of the animals at the zoo. So, thank you.